Good morning. We continue in this year to make our way through Matthew's Gospel. There are 28 chapters in his Gospel, and we're in the 13th now. We're about halfway through, and Matthew takes this time in the middle of his Gospel to take the parables of Jesus, and pretty much they're all on display here. I could speak about each one of these parables, but that would make the homily probably 30 minutes long. I'm not going to do that. But I want to get into the question of the source of evil. And I want to make clear what Jesus makes very clear in the gospel today in his parable, that there is a distinction between good and evil. It deals a lot with the question of how we interact with God and how we interact with people. Let's make the distinction first in God. There's an old question that the church has had to deal with for a very long time, and that is the question of evil. Most people, I think, and St. Thomas Aquinas, a very famous theologian from the 12th century, says there are only two reasons why people would reject the existence of God. You're surprised to find out that there's only two, but when it comes down to it, really there are only two. The first one is that God is not necessary for explaining the universe. So Richard Dawkins would be somebody in this camp, somebody who through science has come up with some equation in order to explain the universe without needing God, that the universe could have come into existence without God. But pushed a little further always, he has to admit himself that it doesn't mean that God does not exist. His theory is, after all, just a theory, and the idea that you don't necessarily need God does not mean that God doesn't exist. So much for that one. But the second reason, and I think probably the reason that most of us deep down inside of our hearts struggle with, because it's a natural experience of everyday life, is the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to us? We do everything that we're supposed to do, but yet we ask the question like, why did my 2-year-old die? Why did my 17-year-old get killed in a car accident? Why does my mother have cancer? So the formulation is very simple. If God is all-knowing, and he is, then he would know that this is the situation we're in. If God was all good, which he is, then he would want to do something about it. And if God was all-powerful, which he is, then he could do something about it. But since bad things happen to me, I experience evil of death or sickness in my life, can God really, a good God who's all-powerful and all-knowing, really exist? It's a good objection. But I think the primary rebuttal to that objection in the question, what is God doing about this, is the question we have to ask and rephrase and say, what has God done about this? When people ask questions like that, I can only do one thing and point them to the mystery of the cross. I remember a professor once telling me he was at a funeral and he had just completed the rites for burying someone, and another man not associated with that funeral came up to him and said, "Father, I stopped believing in God when my wife died." And he simply said to the man, "Well, that's really inconvenient." Because it was precisely in the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, the display of sin and evil in the world, which gave us the opportunity to be freed from sin, to be freed from evil in God's heavenly kingdom. You see, many people associate evil with God, but it was through free choice of the angels and of human beings that sin and death entered the world in the first place. And so failing to make that distinction between God and evil, evil does not have its own existence. Evil cannot exist on its own. What is it? It's a parasite. It only thrives on corrupting what is good, because God created the world good, and it was evil that corrupted it. And that happens so often just because of the way we speak. And I'll get into that in a second. The next thing I want to distinguish, because remember, the good seed sown is distinguished that God sows, and the bad seed is distinguished by the enemy, what is sowed, that very oftentimes we don't always acknowledge the distinction between good and evil. Of all of the things that the Pope has said in his pontificate, all of the things that have made media coverage, the one thing they very rarely cover is the fact that the Pope, since his pontificate, has mentioned evil, the devil, and his work in the world more times than any of his predecessors, I think. They never mention it. Why? Because it would draw into the open where the real battle lies. St. Paul tells us very clearly, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. If you think the enemy is the person sitting next to you, or the person out there at work, or the person in your family that you don't like, you're wrong. That's a surface, an indication of it. But you get below the surface and you will realize that there is something more going on. A battle at the level of the very being of our souls. This happens and we get confused because of the way we speak. And I want to give you a few examples. You go to Menards, you're looking at lumber. You're going to do a home improvement project, or at least try. If you go to Menards on a regular basis, I will probably see you there. And you're looking at 2x4s. And you look down, right? Hopefully, if you know what you're doing, you're going to look at them and make sure they're straight. What happens if one is all crooked and all bent? You say, it's not a good 2x4. What do? You throw it back on the pile. Well, is the problem that the 2x4 isn't good? Or is the problem that it's the bends and the warps in the 2x4 that are making it bad? You see the distinction. We look at a warped 2x4 and we say it's bad. But Menards is going to get that 2x4 back and they're going to cut the warp out and they're going to resell it. Say, you got a good board now. Another example, tooth. I was never part of the No Cavity Club, so if you were, congratulations, but you go into the dentist, you get a cavity in your tooth. What do you say? You got a bad tooth. Is the tooth bad? Or is it the cavity in the tooth that makes it bad? You know, a lot of this failure to distinguish, I think, to be honest, comes from Star Wars. In Star Wars, good and evil are locked in this eternal battle. Like there's always got to be a Sith Lord. There's always got to be the Jedi that are coming up after it. The reality is God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and not even evil can do anything or make any progress without his permission. The devil is completely dependent on God. We have to remember that. Last one, this one gets a little more personal. Not for me, but just people-oriented. Prisoners, convicts. Oshkosh Prison is right down the road. I used to go there for 2 years. I heard confessions sometimes for up to 3 hours. When you think of a convict, and most convicts think of themselves this way, as being bound to their conviction. I am X, Y, and Z. That's what the judge told me. That's what they convicted me of. Are they guilty? I don't know, probably. We'll just say for the circumstances that they are. But can you bind somebody to that? Can you say that you're a bad person because of a mistake you made? In some sense, I suppose we could say then that we'd all have to be bad people. But the reality is, because of the way we speak and the failure we take to make distinctions, is that it isn't the person that's bad because God created you good. It's the choices that we make that begin to corrupt us. And that's why we have the great sacrament of reconciliation. Reconciliation helps us to recognize, when are those seeds sowed by the enemy? They're sowed when everyone is asleep. Take that in the spiritual sense. When we don't know ourselves, when we don't know our weaknesses, when we don't address them, when we refuse to let others help us with them, it's like we're spiritually sleeping. And the seed that the enemy sows begins to take root within us. Prayer. Prayer opens us up to being reflective on who we are and where we need that help in our lives. And reading the Scripture is sort of like a barometer for judging what is right and what is wrong. What is good as God has revealed it to us, and what is evil as God has revealed it to us. So friends, today I want to leave you with just one reminder. And if this isn't true for you, but I would bet my money, but I don't have a lot. I would bet my right pinky that every one of us in this church is undergoing a great battle. If that's not true for you, come up after Mass and tell me that's not true. This is why it is so important to come to Mass, so important to get to know yourself, so important to engage the struggle, that it's not something outside of you very often that you're struggling against. It's something within you. And the church is here always to help. So friends, today as you leave Mass, remember in all of your dealings with people at work, people at the store, wherever you go, be kind to people. Why? Because everyone you meet in the world when you leave this church is indeed undergoing a great battle. We know it's true for ourselves. Make sure we're aware of it, and we're kind to people knowing that's going on in their lives too. And remember who the battle is really about, who it's against. Not each other, but against the one that sows the bad seed. And let's make sure we focus on our struggle against that.